So I think those two are going together. And one of the good things about that is that the sort of Pacific trough weather regime pattern that we see can transition quite easily into a Greenland blocking type regime should the vortex weaken. And so I think that pattern there is quite well set up for something to change into January if the stratosphere does weaken in the way that the forecasts have suggested. In a similar way, having the MJO in phase 7 can also foster a negative NAO as a stronger response to the sudden warming. And we saw things like the strong phase 7 of the MJO in the weeks leading up to the February 2018 sudden stratospheric warming. It was particularly famous for the cold air outbreak it brought across Europe, but there was also cold air over North America afterwards. And so I think whilst a few of these signals in isolation, maybe without the stratosphere, could seem competing, I think they're not necessarily destructive.
Okay. So let's say that, the Pacific trough pattern and helps to weaken the stratospheric polar vortex. If it does weaken considerably in January, or we have a stratospheric warming event, that does not necessarily mean that as soon as it happens, North America is going to be in an ice box, correct?
Absolutely. So there is often both some delay between getting those anomalies further down from up in the mid-stratosphere, where we detect sudden warmings at about 30 kilometers or so, down toward just above the troposphere, where it then influences our weather in the lower stratosphere. So there's sort of that component. Then even once the vortex is disrupted there, sometimes things don't couple to the troposphere even immediately. And a good example of this was the sudden warming that occurred in mid-February of 2023. And that actually only coupled clearly to the troposphere for a very brief period, right at the end of February and into early March. And so there was no huge record-breaking cold air outbreak over North America or even Europe, for that matter, following that sudden warming. It does increase the probability of some of these different weather patterns, a negative NAO type regime, and it does increase the risk of colder weather and certainly puts the dampers on some of these more extremely mild patterns that we see. But it is in no means sudden warming occurs, snow in my backyard. And it's not so much that on the weather timescale that people should be thinking about.
And we've seen the cold air propagate from Europe. Now it's in Japan. So that cold air mass that's moving across the globe, it's not necessarily going to move across Alaska and then come down into the US like by Christmas, right?
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about that cold air mass that's now in East Asia is that that's actually one of the contributing factors to the extremely strong Pacific jet stream that we're expecting to see.
Okay. So yeah, there usually can be a time lag, as you said. So if we do have a disruptive polar vortex, we could still go through the month of January in the US and have a very warm pattern and not see the implications of it until maybe February or early March then, correct?
So the influence of sudden warmings can persist for 2 months or so. They disrupt the circulation in the lower stratosphere for about that length of time. And so during that time, there's generally this force acting on the troposphere that's sort of shifting weather patterns in a certain direction. And so really at any point within that time, then you can get into one of these weather patterns that does lead to cold air locally where you are. But it is sort of thinking about that increased risk for 2 months or so. And that's really why we talk about them, because they give you this longer term probabilistic information.
Now, if the polar vortex does weaken considerably during the middle part of the winter, there's a pretty good probability, would you say, that it would not strengthen later in the winter and we would not have a dynamic final warming during the springtime, correct?
So it's an interesting thing to think about. So if we go to something like 2019, there was a sudden warming on January 2nd. What followed afterwards, because when a sudden warming happens, the stratosphere gets essentially cut off from any of the waves that are propagating up from the troposphere. And so the vortex after the sudden warming can reestablish itself if there's enough time in the season left, and then can actually become unusually strong. And sometimes this is referred to as a polar jet oscillation event. And so actually what happened in 2019 was by March, the vortex was unusually strong, and that did actually couple down to the troposphere quite well. Now, what happened subsequently was that there was quite a late final warming beyond that, which in 2019 was kind of an unusual hybrid of dynamic and radiative. But you're right in saying that if we don't have a sudden warming in midwinter, then we are more likely to have a kind of sudden warming type final warming come March or early April. But if you do have one in the middle of the winter, then the opposite is true.
I know typically with a very strong east-based El Nino with the temperature regime, you typically get the best chance of cold air and snow in the eastern U.S. In February, there's a big spike in February. January is usually warm, big spike in February, and then a little bit of a drop in March. So theoretically, if everything comes together, we could maybe see that dip in the temperatures and maybe the prospect for snow slightly earlier than the typical strong east-based El Nino pattern then, correct?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting component of this is that when you look at composites based on El Nino, you also essentially factor in the aspect that a lot of El Nino events have sudden warmings in those winters. And so actually, if you condition based on whether or not the sudden warming occurs, sometimes you might get a different answer. But I think that the average is that there is. Observationally speaking, we tend to have sudden warmings happen more in El Nino and La Nina than in ENSO neutral conditions. And so that does kind of play into, I think that's something that everybody should be mindful of is when you condition on El Nino, you don't remove the stratosphere. And that will always be factored in because there is a stratospheric anomaly in El Nino winters. But certainly the late winter is where that biggest signal is.
Yeah. You said last time it would be very unusual to have a stratospheric warming event this winter because we've had one, what, the last two winters?
Yeah, we had one in 2021 and in 2023. So to have one in two back-to-back winters is unusual. It's not unprecedented. It happened in 2018 and 2019, and it happened a few times in the 2000s. Sudden warmings seem to have some sort of multi-decadal variability in their frequency. They were very rare in the 1990s. They were sort of rare in 2013 to 2018, and now they seem to have become more common again. So I wouldn't read too much into it necessarily, but it's certainly a fun time to be involved in this field.
Yeah, and additionally, this winter will probably go down as one that, meteorologists and scientists will study in the future when it comes to some of the signals that we've seen kind of early in the season. But I also think the prospect for, as meteorologists, we look at the forecast model data. I think that, at least myself, that going forward through the winter season, we could see some false alarms with the shifting pattern where maybe the models back in November were showing, oh, we're going to have a cold outbreak in, Christmas. And now it looks like Christmas is going to be really warm. I personally, based on my experience, there's going to be a delay in these patterns. Eventually it's going to happen, but I think that the delay could create some false alarms. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think we don't look at false alarms nearly enough. I think they're very interesting. I mean, in February of 2023, there were false alarms for the sudden warming, which then did eventually happen. There's something similar happened in 2018. They're interesting. They can give you a hint, I think, that something is increasingly likely, that it's just difficult to predict when. And so I think there's still utility sometimes in monitoring those forecasts that are hinting at something, whether or not it verifies, because I think it gives you just an overall picture of where you're lying in a probability space.
Right, right. Okay. That's all that I had. Is there anything that you wanted to mention?
No, I think we've covered most things. Yeah.